Today we're going to look at Chapter 3, which is the last chapter in Unit 1 that we will be looking at before you take your first quiz. This chapter is going to deal with global business. It's entitled Business in a Changing World. One thing that or one company that we tend to think about when we think of international trade, of course, is McDonald's, because McDonald's, you would find a McDonald's in just about every country that you visit. And the book talks about how popular they have become in China. But we have to think about that even the people in China and India and Japan, that they are purchasing our electrical equipment, clothing. Of course, rock music is very high on their agenda in these countries, computers, robots, and household goods. One thing I found interesting was that our book talked about how Subway has surpassed McDonald's as the largest global restaurant chain. With more than 43,000 restaurants. And I tend to think one of the reasons being is that the Subways seem to be more healthier food than, of course, a McDonald's, Big Mac, or something like that. The next slide is a video that I found on why it's important for us as businesses within the United States to do businesses and have international trade. So enjoy.
Well, since antiquity, international business has been important. But what's new nowadays, it's very important. For some countries, international business can comprise 50% or more of total economic activity. So it's an area one better be informed about because it has a major impact on all of our lives.
For the consumer?
Absolutely. It is crucial in terms of facilitating exchanges in different corners of the world and in terms of lowering prices. Because keep in mind, while international business, Marco Polo already did international business with China, but it typically used to be directed at the leaders, the kings, the royalty. They were able to get international pepper and silk delivered. But now international business is crucially linked to every man in the street and every woman and every child. That's how they get high quality, low cost goods and services.
We live in a global economy. Consumers everywhere around the world, they drink Coke or Pepsi, they eat at McDonald's, Pizza Hut, and as I said in a couple of slides, Subway is the largest one throughout the world. But as the differences among nations continue to narrow, along with one of the things is the falling political barriers, and of course new technology, the trend toward globalization of business becomes increasingly important. And if we want our business to succeed, we are going to have to seek out and start to be global within our products and marketing. Nations and businesses engage in international trade to obtain the raw materials and goods that are otherwise unavailable to them, or that may be available elsewhere at a lower price than they could produce within our country. A nation or an individual organizations from a nation will sell their surplus materials and goods to acquire the money to buy goods and services or ideas for its peoples that they need. Some nations have a monopoly on a resource or product. Such a monopoly, or what is considered absolute advantage, exists when a country is the only source of an item or the only producer of an item that is the most efficient product of that product. And then a company's comparative advantage is the basis of most international trade. And this occurs when a country specializes in products that it can supply more efficiently or at a lower cost. Most nations have such an advantage in some areas, and then they trade for those that they do not have. India and Ireland are examples of countries that are gaining a comparative advantage over the United States in the provision of some services, such as call center operations. That's probably the most frequent one. Engineering and software program. As a result, there are some U.S. companies increasingly outsourcing or transferring their manufacturing and other tasks to countries where the labor and the supplies are often less expensive. Whereas we have someone that would work for $12 to $15 an hour. In India, they would work for maybe $1 an hour. And so our companies take our products and they send them to other countries. Outsourcing has become a very controversial practice in the U.S. because so many jobs have moved overseas where the task can be accomplished at those lower costs I was telling you about. Most nations are going to trade globally to be able to get those goods and services, and then of course the money they need to pay for them. So they participate in exporting and importing. Exporting is the sale of goods and services to foreign countries, and importing is the purchase of goods and services from foreign markets. Notice on this slide our U.S. exports equal about $2.3 trillion, and our imports are $2.9 trillion. So if you look at this slide, the balance of trade is considered the difference in value between what a nation exports and what it imports. And when you have a trade deficit, which if we're exporting 2.9 trillion, but we're only bringing in 2.3 trillion, that means we have a trade deficit because we are importing more products than we are exporting. And then the balance of payments is the difference between the flow of money into and out of the country. So we would subtract that 2.9 trillion minus the 2.3 trillion. While there's a substantial amount of international trade, free trade seldom exists because there are some barriers. And so we're going to talk about a couple of barriers: economic barriers, ethic, legal, political, social, and cultural, and of course technological barriers. This next slide is a short video I found on why we should have international business. So enjoy that slide also.
The same regardless of where it is conducted. Sure, I may have to get someone to translate for me or change money at the bank, but a transaction is a transaction, and people have been transacting across borders for centuries. Moreover, you may have vacationed, done volunteer work, or even been an exchange student in another country. You recognize that there are differences, but how does that really hinder me from doing business? After all, we are all human, and for the most part, we all must produce and consume to stay alive. Besides, how different can international business be from domestic business? Well, it turns out that international business is often quite different from doing business in your home country. International business is technically defined as all commercial transactions, including sales, investments, and transportation that take place between two or more countries. In other words, it is the act of doing business across national borders. The reality is that when you cross national borders, many of the taken for granted assumptions about the way the business world works need to be re-examined. Take opening up a restaurant in the United States, for example. When you do business in the U.S., there are many external factors that are fairly consistent across companies and even industries. You assume that you can pay your employees what you want, as long as you don't go below the minimum wage, and meet other basic work requirements, all of which are readily available. You can assume that these requirements will not change much over time. You can also assume that the government will not mind if you open up another restaurant. As long as you get a business permit and a food license, you're good to go. You also correctly assume that you will be able to either buy or rent a building for your restaurant, and that you can choose the location. You can search on your own or through a realtor, and you'll be able to negotiate the price. You are also fairly familiar with the local tastes and preferences, so you have an idea of what foods people will like. Essentially, they like what you like. You assume that the US dollar will hold its value and that people will be able to pay with cash or credit cards. You assume that you will not be asked for bribes to open or continue with your business and that you will not need to pay protection money to organized crime leaders in your area. Finally, you assume that you will be able to use social media and the internet to advertise and offer online reservations. Most of these assumptions may sound pretty silly. Of course I'll be able to choose the location of my restaurant. Of course the US dollar will be an acceptable form of currency. But when you do business internationally, all of these assumptions need to be questioned and modified to address the realities of a global environment.
When you or your company are considering doing business in another country, as a manager, you need to consider a couple of things. And the first one we're going to talk about is economic factors. Now, we do have 4 industrialized nations that we tend to think of as being more economically advanced. And those are the United States, Japan, Great Britain, and China. Some of the less developed countries have a low per capita income, but they offer a potentially huge and profitable untapped market that within the next probably 5 to 10 years that we're going to see a boom in international business within their areas. Another area that, as a manager, you need to look at when you're considering international trade is the infrastructure and the exchange rate. Now, when we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about physical facilities that would support the country's economic activities, which could include railways, highways, ports for ships to come in, utilities and power, anything like that. The level of development is determined in part by the country's infrastructure. And then another area that you want to look at is the ratio at which one nation's currency can be exchanged for another one. Exchange rates differ every day, and it affects the cost of imports and exports. Sometimes a government may intentionally alter the value of its currency through their fiscal policy in order to drive up the value of their money. So that again is another thing that you need to consider when you're looking at going into especially underdeveloped countries. The infrastructure is a big area you need to look at. Some of the other things, while infrastructure and exchange rate are important, you need to look at ethical, legal, and political barriers. When entering the international marketplace, companies contend with potentially complex relationships. Laws different from nation to nation, international laws. When we're dealing with the governments of China and Saudi Arabia and different things like that, their laws are totally different than ours. So we have to think about that. Although we know that women are there is competent in the business area, when working in the Arab countries, women are not viewed as competent as men. So you would have to think about salespeople. Do you send women to those areas? Those are things that you have to look at. Various trade restrictions. And again, some of the Arabian countries, they don't eat cows, so you wouldn't want to open up hamburger places a lot. And then the changing political climates. The third world countries, they change who's in charge of their country quite frequently. Those are things you have to think about. And then, of course, there's different ethical values, different things we have to think about in that area. Um, some of the other things are the laws and regulations. In the United States, a number of our laws are activities the U.S. firms engaged in international trade that they have to, abide by our laws and also the laws of the host countries. Americans take for granted many of the legal rights that we as Americans take for granted don't exist in other countries. And so we have to make sure that a firm doing business abroad must obey and understand the laws of that host country. Some countries fail to honor U.S. laws or fail to enforce their own laws. So when we're thinking about that, we have to think about our employees. Are we putting employees that we are sending to other countries in harm's way? We have to think about those. Okay, let's talk just a minute about import tariffs. Tariffs and other trade restrictions are part of the host country's legal structure, and they can be added or removed for political reasons. An import tariff is a tax levied by a nation on goods imported into the country. Now, we're just kind of talking about these two for in this slide. Fixed tariffs is a specific amount of money levied on each unit of product brought into the country. An ad valorem tariff is based on the value of the item. Critics, we talked about them, levying tariffs for political reasons. Critics argue that the use of tariffs inhibit free trade and competition. But then supporters also say that it insulates domestic industries, allowing them against well-established foreign competitiveness. Again, we talked about the exchange controls a few slides ago, but it is a regulation that restricts the amount of currency that can be brought in or sold within the countries. Some countries control their foreign trade by forcing business people to buy and sell foreign products through a central bank, and they do that when foreign country is in short supply. Other legal barriers to trade are some quotas, embargoes, and what is considered dumping practices. Quotas are the restriction on the number of units of a particular product that can be imported into a country. An embargo is prohibits the trade of a particular product. And dumping is the act of a country or business selling products at less than what it costs to produce them in order to get into the country. Now, when we look at a quota, that would be like the United States saying you can only bring in 50,000 Toyotas a year. An embargo, we had an embargo with Cuba where we didn't let them use their Cuban cigars. And the next slide, let's move on to that one. Talks about what dumping is, and a company will dump its products for several reasons. Again, it's a quick way to get their product into the market, and when the domestic market is too small to support the efficient level of production. And then, of course, technology has obsolete products that are no longer sellable within those countries. So they kind of dump them in another country for them to try to sell. One of the in a earlier book, it talked about tires. China dumped tires in the United States that they could no longer sell over there. So that's the actions of what is considered dumping. Another barrier that we want to look at is the political barriers that you want to think about that affect international business. And to me, this is one of the most important ones, is because they seldom are in writing and they may change from one day to the next. One of the big things that we have to think about is the political unrest, which could create a hostile environment. Not just that, it could be very dangerous for employees that have to either travel or work in the foreign countries. A cartel is a group of firms or nations that agree to act as a monopoly and do not compete with each other. OPEC is one of the most frequent and ones we think about often. OPEC, of course, being the oil cartel. Another thing is you want to think about is social and cultural barriers, and you can minimize problems associated with these by doing your research before you even attempt to do business internationally, or even go to visit countries that are within other cultures. Remember, there's always differences in spoken and written language. One of the things we have to be very careful about is body language. Gestures we use could be offensive in other countries. Family roles. One of the most important ones dealing with Spanish Latin American countries is the different in time. In the Latin American countries, they, if they're an hour late for a meeting, that's okay. It doesn't seem to bother them. But if you go into the Asian communities, time is very, very important to them. You are never late for a business meeting. So those are things that we need to think about, along with their customs and holiday systems. This next slide that you're going to look at actually has talking about ways that we can offend people within other countries. Talking about technological barriers, Technological advances are beginning to create global marketing opportunities. It also creates new challenges and competitions as some of the even less developed countries are beginning to have access to internet and computers and the other technology advances that are out there. That's allowing new competitors to challenge the U.S. Think about that the top 3 PC companies are from the countries in the Asian country. We talked about how infrastructure barriers can be a detriment in international countries, but how we can do that, how we can turn those barriers into opportunity, is we know that we can view these barriers as opportunities using some of the things that we have available within our country. Although the economical, political, legal, and social barriers seem like things that are going to prohibit international trade, there are some organization and agreements that help foster international and global trade. And a couple of these are the GATT. The first one is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and it was actually signed in 1947 by 23 nations, and it provides a forum for tariff negotiation, and it's also a place where these countries come together to discuss problems. One of the most frequent and one that we hear of mostly is the World Trade Organization, or it's known as the WTO, and it's an international organization that deals with the rules of nations and it evolved after GATT. The North American Free Trade Agreement. This probably is one that you hear about. It is discussed in political barriers. It is our president has talked about it. It's just one that there's a lot of controversy against. It's an agreement that eliminates most tariffs and trade restriction on agriculture and manufactured products to encourage trade within Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. The next slide I have for you actually talks about NAFTA. So if you'll listen to this, it'll give you an overview and a background of NAFTA. A couple of other unions that you want to look at is the European Union and the Asia Pacific Union. The European Union was established in 1958, and it's one of the single largest markets today with a GDP, which stands for Gross Domestic Product, of $15.8 trillion. What's interesting is if you do some research, you will see that some of the bigger countries have begun to pull out of the European Union. So we don't know what the effect of that would be on the international market. The Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation Union is an international trade alliance that promotes trade and economic technical cooperation among its nations. APAC is the Asian Pacific Economic Corporation, and it includes all the countries listed below. And if you look at it, most of them are Asian countries, and they're beginning to really be competitive and sophisticated in global business. And then just a couple of the other smaller ones, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. It has a gross domestic product of 2.5 trillion. I don't know a lot about this one. The World Bank, it was actually established in 1946 to loan money to underdeveloped and developing countries. And from that was the International Monetary Fund, which was established in 1947. And what its main focus was to eliminate trade barriers. Some companies first get involved in international trade when they are importing goods to resell within their own countries. They can also establish what is called a counter trade agreement, and it's a foreign trade agreement that involves bartering products or for instead of currency. So, you know, I will give, if you will send me grain, then I will send you cows or something like that. So that's a counter. And export agents are just that middleman that helps in the handling of international transactions. When you're thinking of getting involved in international business, a couple of things you want to look at. There's a trading company, and it's a firm that buys goods in one country and sells them to buyers in another country. And what they do is they handle all the trade activities. They're similar to what is considered an export agent, but they have a much broader role. Another thing is licensing, and it's a trade agreement in which one company it's considered the licensor allows another company that's the licensee to use its company name. And it's an attractive alternative to direct investment when the political stability of a company is in, or a country is in doubt. Franchising is another way that you can look at getting involved in international business, and that is when a franchisor which agrees to provide a franchisee a name, a logo, a method of operation, advertisement, and different things like that. Now, we will get into franchising in another chapter, but this one is basically dealing with international company, because it allows companies to enter the international marketplace without having to spend a lot of money. Now, another thing that you could consider is contract manufacturing, and then, of course, outsourcing. When we look at contract manufacturing, it's the hiring of a foreign company to produce specified volumes of initiating company's product to specification. And for instance, Reebok uses contract manufacturers to produce many of their shoes. They say, okay, I need this number of shoes. And of course, we know that Reebok is a China-based company. Outsourcing, and we have talked a lot about outsourcing in other chapters, and we've talked about it, talk about it in economics, and it's just basically transferring task to other countries where the costs are lower. Insourcing is where foreign company transfer task to the U.S. companies. You also have offshoring and joint venture. Offshoring is the relocation of a business processed by a company or a subsidiary to another company. And it is different from an outsourcing because the company retains control by not subcontracting to another company. A joint venture is when two companies or two businesses share the cost of an operation in a business between someone that's local and a foreign country. And it's used in countries forbidding direct investment from foreign company, or when a company lacks resource or expertise. A strategic alliance is basically when a partnership is formed to create a competitive advantage. And it's used when competition is fierce and costs are very high. It is becoming predominant in the automobile and computer industries because of the competition within those two industries. Direct investment is when the ownership of an overseas facility for companies who want more control, and they're willing to invest considerable resources where they may involve new facilities or purchase of an existing operation. I can give you a scenario on the direct investment. My brother-in-law works for Mohawk Carpet, and that is his job. Is he goes to other countries and he looks to see where they can buy facilities to actually go in and open up factories in those countries to produce flooring. Multinational corporation is a corporation that operates on the worldwide scale, and they actually do not have a significant tie to any one country or region. They often have greater assets in the country in which they operate. When we talk about global strategy and multinational strategy, global strategy involves standardization of products for the whole world, as if the whole world were one single entity, and multinational strategy is a plan used by international companies that involve customization, products, promotion, and distribution according to the cultural, technology, regions, and their differences. And these are some discussion questions that you could look at. I'm not sure yet if I'll use one of these as your discussion board question for this week. Thank you, and hope you've enjoyed Chapter 3. But remember, you do have a Unit 1 exam on Chapters 1 through 3, so you may want to review Chapters 1 and 2 before you take your test.